Most people never noticed him, and that was exactly how his days passed, quietly and without recognition. Before the sun even rose, while the city still sat in that heavy silence between night and morning, he was already awake. His alarm didn't need to ring twice. There was no room in his life for snoozing or slowing down. A small apartment, 2 rooms barely holding together his world, greeted him with the faint hum of an old refrigerator and the soft breathing of his child in the next room. He would pause there for a moment every morning, just standing in the doorway, watching, reminding himself why he kept going even when everything felt like it was slipping out of his hands. Being a single father wasn't something he had planned for, and it wasn't something anyone had prepared him to handle. It came suddenly, like a storm that never passed, leaving him to pick up every piece and carry it alone. There were no shared responsibilities, no one to trade shifts with when exhaustion hit, no backup plan when things went wrong. It was just him, every day, figuring things out one step at a time. He learned how to braid hair from late-night videos, how to stretch a small paycheck across groceries, rent, school supplies, and unexpected bills that always seemed to arrive at the worst possible moment. Some nights dinner was simple, and some nights it was even simpler than that. But he always made sure there was something on the table, even if he went without. His job as a janitor wasn't something he talked about much, not because he was ashamed, but because people often made assumptions before he even had the chance to speak. To them, he was just part of the background, someone who wiped down desks and emptied trash bins long after important meetings ended and powerful decisions were made. They didn't see the way he took pride in his work, how he stayed a little longer to make sure everything was spotless, how he fixed things quietly when they broke so others wouldn't have to deal with inconvenience. He understood something most people overlooked. That dignity didn't come from a title or a paycheck. It came from how you carried yourself when no one was watching. Still, the weight of being unseen followed him everywhere. In the hallways he cleaned, conversations would continue as if he wasn't there. People would step around him without a glance, their voices full of plans and opportunities that felt worlds away from his reality. But he listened, not out of envy, but out of curiosity, trying to understand a life that seemed so distant from his own. Every dollar he earned had a purpose. Rent came first, always. Then food. Then whatever his child needed for school. There was never much left after that, but he managed. He always managed. When things got tight, he picked up extra shifts, working late into the night until his body ached and his eyes struggled to stay open. Even then, he'd come home, check homework, prepare clothes for the next day, and set everything in place so the morning would run just a little smoother. Sleep became a luxury he couldn't afford often, but love kept him moving forward. There were moments, quiet ones, when doubt crept in, when he wondered if he was doing enough, if he was giving his child the life they deserved. Those thoughts didn't stay long. They couldn't, because every time he saw that small smile, every time he heard laughter echo through their modest home, it reminded him that what he was building mattered. He wasn't just surviving. He was creating stability out of chaos, safety out of uncertainty. People might have seen a janitor, but his child saw something else entirely. Someone dependable, someone strong, someone who never gave up, no matter how hard things got. And that was a responsibility he carried with more pride than any title could ever offer. The case had already drawn attention long before the courtroom filled that morning. People whispered about it in hallways, in offices, in places where decisions were usually made behind closed doors. It involved a young girl, barely old enough to understand the weight of what was happening to her, yet somehow standing at the center of something far bigger than herself. Her name had been mentioned in reports, in quiet conversations, in concerned voices that carried both sympathy and doubt. Some believed her story, others questioned it, but no one could ignore it. By the time the hearing began, the air inside the courtroom felt heavier than usual, as if everyone present understood that what would happen there could shape more than just one life. She sat near the front, small and still, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if she were holding herself together. Every movement around her seemed louder than it should have been. Papers shuffled, chairs creaked, low voices passed between attorneys preparing their arguments. Yet she remained silent, eyes fixed on a point somewhere ahead, trying to stay steady in a place that felt anything but safe. The system wasn't built to feel welcoming, especially not to someone like her. It spoke in complex language, in procedures and rules that made it hard for an ordinary person to keep up, let alone a child who should have been worrying about school, friends, and simple things that most people took for granted. Instead, she found herself surrounded by strangers discussing her life as if it were a case file, something to be analyzed and debated. The details of what had happened to her were complicated, layered with uncertainty and conflicting accounts. There were moments in her story that didn't line up perfectly, and those gaps became the focus for those trying to challenge her credibility. Questions were asked in ways that felt less like an attempt to understand and more like an effort to break her down. Each time she spoke, her voice barely rose above a whisper, yet it carried a truth that didn't need to be loud to be real. Still, truth in a courtroom often had to compete with strategy, with persuasion, with the ability to present facts in a way that would convince those in power. Her situation wasn't just about what had happened. It was about whether anyone would believe her enough to protect her from what could come next. There were stakes that went beyond legal consequences. If the decision went against her, it could send her back into an environment that had already caused harm, a place where her voice might never be heard again. That possibility hung in the room like a shadow no one wanted to acknowledge out loud. The people representing her tried to build a case strong enough to shield her, but they were up against influence, against resources that could twist the narrative in subtle ways. Across the room, the opposing side carried themselves with confidence, their presence backed by power that didn't need to be explained. They spoke with certainty, as if the outcome was already leaning in their favor. Every word they chose felt calculated, designed to create doubt where there had once been clarity. It wasn't just about facts anymore. It was about perception, about whose version of the story would take hold. The girl felt that shift even if she couldn't fully understand it. She sensed the way the room reacted, the pauses, the exchanged glances, the unspoken judgments forming in real time. It made her shrink further into her seat, as if becoming smaller could somehow protect her from the weight of it all. She wasn't supposed to carry this kind of burden. No child should have to sit in a room full of adults debating whether their pain was valid, whether their fear was justified, whether their future was worth safeguarding. Yet there she was, caught in a system that demanded strength from her without offering much in return. Every second stretched longer than it should have, each moment building toward a decision that felt both distant and dangerously close. The judge listened carefully, maintaining a neutral expression that revealed nothing about what he was thinking. It was impossible to tell which way things were leaning, whether the arguments were landing or falling short. That uncertainty only added to the tension, making it harder for anyone on her side to feel secure. The case wasn't just a legal matter anymore. It had become a test of whether someone without power could stand against those who had plenty of it and still be seen, still be protected, still be given a chance at something better. Up until that moment, he had done what he always did, stayed quiet, kept his head down, and moved through the background like he didn't belong in the room at all. He stood near the back wall, hands rough from years of work resting against the handle of a cleaning cart he had no real reason to bring inside, except that it gave him a reason to be there without being questioned. People had walked past him without a glance when the session began, assuming he was just another part of the building, someone invisible, someone who didn't matter to what was unfolding at the front of the room. He had heard enough by then, more than he was supposed to, more than anyone thought he understood. Every word spoken about the girl reached him clearly, cutting through the silence he had trained himself to live in. At first, he tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the small, repetitive motions that had defined his days for years. Wipe, straighten, move on. But this wasn't a hallway or an office after hours. This wasn't a space where he could detach himself and let the world pass by without getting involved. Something about the way the girl sat there, so still, so alone, reminded him of someone he knew too well. He saw the same quiet fear, the same effort to stay strong when everything inside was trembling. It pulled at something deep within him, something he had kept buried beneath routine and responsibility. He shifted his weight, eyes lowering for a moment as if that could steady the thoughts beginning to rise in his mind. This wasn't his place. That's what he told himself. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't anyone important. People like him didn't speak up in rooms like this. They didn't interrupt proceedings or challenge what was being said. They stayed in their lane, did their job, and left without drawing attention. That's how he had survived this long, by knowing where he was allowed to stand and never stepping beyond it. But the longer he listened, the harder it became to stay still. The questions directed at the girl grew sharper, more pointed, designed to make her doubt herself, to make others doubt her too. He could hear it in the tone, in the pauses that followed her answers, in the subtle shifts of expression from those seated around her. It wasn't just about finding the truth anymore. It felt like something else, something colder, something that didn't care about what she had gone through as long as it could reshape the story into something more convenient. His grip tightened around the card handle, knuckles pressing wide against the metal as his jaw set. A familiar tension built in his chest, the kind he usually pushed down and ignored. This time it didn't stay quiet. Memories flashed through his mind, moments when he had wanted to speak but hadn't, times when silence had felt safer than risking the consequences of being heard. He had convinced himself that keeping his head down was the right choice, that staying invisible protected what little stability he had built for his child. But standing there, watching that girl face everything alone, that belief started to crack. His breathing slowed, not because he was calm, but because he was trying to hold back something that refused to be contained. The room carried on as if nothing was changing, as if the balance of power remained exactly where it had always been. The attorneys spoke, the judge listened, the audience observed. No one noticed the shift happening in the back of the room, the quiet man who was no longer just listening. His eyes lifted again, this time not dropping away. They stayed fixed on the scene ahead, on the girl whose voice was growing smaller with every passing minute. Something in him made a decision before his mind fully caught up. It wasn't planned. It wasn't calculated. It was instinct, raw and undeniable. His heart pounded harder, each beat louder than the last, until it felt impossible to keep it contained within his chest. His feet moved slightly, just enough to break the stillness he had maintained for so long. The sound of his own voice hadn't been heard in that room, not until it suddenly was. It cut through everything, sharp and unfiltered, carrying a force that surprised even him. "I'll defend her." The words didn't come out quietly. They weren't hesitant or unsure. They filled the room, echoing off walls that had grown used to controlled tones and measured speech. Conversation stopped instantly. Heads turned. The rhythm of the courtroom broke in a way no one expected. For a second, it felt like time had paused, as if the weight of what had just happened needed a moment to settle over everyone present. He stood there, no longer invisible, no longer just a man in the background. The cart beside him, the uniform he wore, the position he held in the world, none of it could pull those words back or soften their impact. He had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, stepping into a space where he wasn't supposed to belong, driven by something stronger than fear, stronger than consequence. For a brief second after his voice rang out, the entire courtroom seemed to lose its structure, as if the invisible rules that held everything in place had been shaken loose. The steady rhythm of legal procedure broke apart. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Papers that had been moving from one hand to another froze in place. Even the faint background noises, the shifting of chairs, the quiet coughs, the subtle murmurs, all faded into a silence so complete it felt almost unnatural. Every head turned toward the back of the room, toward the man no one had paid attention to just moments before. The shift in attention was immediate and intense, like a spotlight snapping on in a dark space. He stood there, shoulders squared in a way that didn't match how he had carried himself before, his presence suddenly too solid to ignore. The words he had spoken still seemed to hang in the air, echoing in the minds of everyone who had heard them. People weren't just surprised, they were trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to fit it into a framework that didn't quite exist. A janitor didn't interrupt the courtroom. A man in his position didn't step forward and insert himself into a legal battle that had nothing to do with him, at least not in any way the system recognized. The attorneys exchanged quick glances, their expressions shifting from focus to confusion in an instant. One of them opened their mouth as if to speak, then stopped, unsure of how to respond to something so far outside the expected flow of events. On the opposing side, there was a flicker of irritation, the kind that came from having control disrupted, from seeing a carefully managed narrative interrupted by an unpredictable voice. The judge leaned forward slightly, his expression tightening, not in anger, but in concentration. Moments like this were rare, and they demanded a response that balanced authority with control. His gavel remained untouched, yet his presence alone carried enough weight to hold the room in place. Still, even he couldn't ignore the fact that something unusual had just occurred, something that had shifted the atmosphere in a way that couldn't be easily reversed. In the gallery, people who had come to observe leaned in, their curiosity overriding the usual restraint expected in such a setting. Whispers began to rise, low and cautious at first, then spreading just enough to create a subtle undercurrent beneath the silence. Who was he? Why did he speak? What did he think he could change? The questions moved quickly, passing from one person to another, each one adding to the growing sense that the moment carried more significance than it first appeared. At the center of it all, the girl lifted her head. For the first time since the proceedings began, her attention shifted away from the pressure surrounding her and towards something unexpected. Her eyes found him, searching, uncertain, yet holding on to the possibility that someone had stepped forward for a reason. The fear that had kept her still didn't disappear, but it changed slightly, making room for something else, something fragile but real. The man himself didn't move right away. It wasn't hesitation as much as it was the weight of what he had just done settling over him. He could feel the eyes on him, could sense the judgment, the confusion, the disbelief. This was the moment where doubt could have pulled him back, where he could have apologized, stepped out, returned to the safety of invisibility. But that path was already gone. The line had been crossed, and there was no pretending otherwise. One of the attorneys finally found their voice, stepping forward with a controlled firmness that tried to restore order. Their words were measured, directed not just at the man, but at the room as a whole, an attempt to re-establish the boundaries that had been disrupted. The law had procedures. The courtroom had structure. People couldn't simply declare themselves part of a case. The logic was clear, familiar, reassuring in its predictability. Yet it didn't fully erase what had just happened, because even as those rules were spoken aloud, the impact of his interruption remained. It had broken through something deeper than procedure. It had exposed the tension that had been building beneath the surface, the imbalance that many had felt but hadn't addressed. The opposing side watched closely, their earlier confidence shifting into something more cautious. They had prepared for arguments, for evidence, for challenges within the expected boundaries of the law. They had not prepared for this. An unknown voice, coming from a place they didn't consider a threat, had forced them to adjust in real time. Their expressions hardened slightly, not out of fear, but out of the need to regain control of a situation that had become less predictable. The judge's gaze remained steady, moving between the man and the attorneys, weighing not just the rules, but the reality of the moment. Authority in a courtroom wasn't just about enforcing procedure, it was about maintaining order in a way that allowed justice to function. And right now, order had been disrupted in a way that couldn't simply be ignored or dismissed without consideration at the front of the courtroom, where authority usually sat without question. The CEO had remained still through most of the proceedings, his presence steady, controlled, and almost detached. He was the kind of man people noticed the moment he entered a room, not because he demanded attention loudly, but because everything about him signaled power. The tailored suit, the composed posture, the quiet confidence in the way he observed without reacting too quickly. People like him were used to influence shaping outcomes long before decisions were officially made. He had listened to the arguments with the calm of someone who trusted the system to work in his favor, or at least in a way he could navigate. Even when the girl spoke, Even when tension built in subtle waves across the room, his expression barely shifted. He had seen situations like this before, moments where emotion tried to challenge structure, where stories collided with strategy, and he knew how those moments usually ended. But when the janitor's voice cut through the room, something changed. It wasn't immediate, not in a way that most people would have noticed right away. At first, he didn't move at all, as if he were processing what had just happened, placing it within a framework that made sense. His eyes, however, shifted slightly, no longer fixed on the attorneys or the judge, but drawn toward the back of the room. There was a pause in him, subtle but real, the kind that comes when something unexpected breaks through a carefully maintained sense of control. The words themselves were simple, but they carried a force that didn't match the man who had spoken them. That contrast was enough to hold his attention. Around him, others reacted quickly, confusion, irritation, curiosity, but he stayed measured, watching instead of responding. It was a habit formed over years of navigating high-stakes environments, where reacting too soon could mean losing an advantage. Still, there was something different in the way he observed this moment. It wasn't just about disruption. It was about intent. The janitor hadn't spoken out of impulse alone, at least not in a careless way. There was conviction in his voice, something grounded, something that didn't come from a place of seeking attention. That detail stood out more than anything else. The CEO leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the table in front of him, a small shift in posture that didn't go unnoticed by those who were used to reading him. It was the first clear sign that he was engaging with what had happened rather than dismissing it. His gaze remained steady, focused on the man in the back, as if trying to understand what had driven him to step out of his place so completely. In most situations, someone like that would have been removed quickly, their interruption treated as nothing more than a breach of protocol. That would have been the expected response, the efficient response, the one that kept everything moving without complication. But the CEO didn't signal for that. He didn't look to security or to anyone else to restore order in that way. Instead, he let the moment stretch a little longer than usual. That choice alone shifted the dynamic again, subtly but significantly. The attorneys picked up on it, their earlier confidence adjusting as they tried to read what his reaction might mean. The judge noticed it too, though his expression remained controlled. Influence in a courtroom didn't always come from spoken words. Sometimes it came from presence, from the way certain people chose to engage or not engage with what was happening. The CEO's silence, paired with his focused attention, carried its own kind of weight. It suggested that the interruption might not be dismissed as easily as expected. His eyes moved briefly toward the girl, taking in her reaction, the way she had lifted her head, the way something in her expression had shifted when the janitor spoke. It was a small detail, easy to overlook if you weren't paying close attention, but he noticed it. He noticed the connection that had formed in that brief moment, the way a single voice from the back of the room had reached her in a way none of the formal arguments had managed to do so far. That observation seemed to settle into him, adding another layer to whatever he was considering. When he finally spoke, it wasn't loud, and it didn't need to be. His voice carried the kind of authority that didn't rely on volume. It cut through the lingering whispers and the attempts to regain control, drawing attention back to the front of the room while still acknowledging what had happened behind him. There was no immediate dismissal in his tone, no quick move to shut things down. Instead, there was something measured, deliberate, as if he were opening a door rather than closing one, allowing the situation to unfold in a way no one had anticipated. What began as a disruption slowly unfolded into something no one in that courtroom had prepared for, not even those who believed they understood every possible outcome. The tension that had once felt controlled and contained started to shift in a different direction, no longer centered only on arguments and legal strategy, but on something more human, something harder to ignore. The janitor stood where he was, fully aware now that there was no returning to the quiet role he had occupied before. Every eye in the room had already placed him into the center of a moment that demanded explanation. The judge's voice eventually guided the proceedings back into motion, not by dismissing him outright, but by allowing space for clarity, for understanding why such an interruption had occurred. That decision alone created an opening, small but significant, where truth had a chance to step forward in a way the structured arguments hadn't allowed. When the janitor spoke again, his voice carried less force than before, but more depth. It wasn't about making a dramatic declaration this time. It was about being heard, about sharing something that couldn't be captured in documents or legal language. He didn't present himself as an expert or someone with authority. Instead, he spoke as a father, as someone who understood what it meant to see fear in a child's eyes and recognize it for what it was. His words didn't follow legal structure, and they didn't need to. They carried experience, and that gave them a kind of credibility that didn't rely on titles. At first, there was resistance. The opposing side tried to challenge his place in the conversation, pointing out that his perspective wasn't part of the case, that emotion couldn't replace evidence. Those arguments were expected, and under normal circumstances, they would have been enough to shut everything down. But something had already shifted in the room. The judge listened, not with full acceptance, but with enough openness to allow the moment to continue. The CEO remained still, his earlier attention now fully engaged, as if he were watching something unfold that went beyond the boundaries of business or influence. The girl listened too, more closely than she had listened to anything else that day. There was a familiarity in the janitor's words, not because he knew her story in detail, but because he understood the feeling beneath it. That connection became visible in the way she held herself, in the way her voice, when she finally spoke again, carried a little more steadiness than before. It wasn't a complete transformation, but it was enough to be noticed, enough to matter. The truth that began to emerge didn't arrive all at once. It came in pieces, in small clarifications that started to fill the gaps that had once been used to question her credibility. With each piece, the narrative that had been carefully shaped against her began to weaken. Details that had seemed uncertain took on new meaning when viewed through a different lens. The room responded to those changes, not with dramatic reactions, but with subtle shifts in attention, in posture, in the way people listened. The opposing side adjusted quickly, trying to regain control, but their earlier certainty no longer carried the same weight. Doubt had moved, no longer focused solely on the girl, but spreading across the arguments that had challenged her. The judge's demeanor reflected that shift, his questions becoming more precise, more focused on uncovering rather than testing. Even the CEO's presence seemed different now, not less powerful, but more invested in the direction things were taking. Whatever expectations he had walked in with no longer fully applied. The moment had outgrown them. For the janitor, standing there meant more than defending someone he barely knew. It meant stepping into a role he had never imagined for himself, one that required courage beyond anything his daily life had demanded. There was risk in what he had done, consequences that could still follow once the courtroom returned to its usual order. But in that moment, those concerns held less weight than the impact his voice was having. The system hadn't changed entirely, and it wouldn't do so overnight, but for a brief space in time, it had made room for something it often overlooked. The girl was no longer just a subject of discussion. She had become someone people were beginning to truly see, not as a case, but as a person whose story deserved to be understood in full. The balance in the room continued to shift, not dramatically, but steadily enough to alter the path the case was taking, with each passing moment building on the last, creating a sense that what had once seemed decided was now open, uncertain, and moving toward a different kind of outcome.